This is what everyone knows Newcastle for, football. But I'm going to tell you about something much, much better.
They want to know about Islam, we'll give them da'wah. They want to know what a Muslim does, we'll give them da'wah. When they want to hate on...
In 2012, I was a non-Muslim who walked into my local masjid. I met the brothers there from IDC. This was a team of brothers who told me about the message of Islam in detail. I took my shahada. The brothers, they didn't just leave me there. You know, they supported me, provided me new Muslim classes, and after all these years, I became the head of the new Muslim department here at IDC, teaching other new Muslims, supporting them and mentoring them, just like I was supported. IDC is not just your typical charity. We have our Islamic awareness stalls engaging with non-Muslims in our local city centre and answering all their questions about Islam, public events and exhibitions for non-Muslims to come learn about Islam, masjid visits for the local community, school visits teaching non-Muslim kids and staff about Islam. We visit the elderly and spend time with them regularly to give them companionship, feeding the homeless every single week, giving them hot meals and advice. We make the children smile every single year by visiting them in the hospitals and giving them gifts. So many people have taken their shahada with us.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Because of this, we then provide new Muslim classes for them and support them on their journey. Please, please, please give whatever you can. Do you know how much you can afford? Better than myself. Some of us can give £10, some of us can give £500, and every single person that accepts Islam, you will get a portion of that reward. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he said that charity does not decrease our wealth. So brothers and sisters, believe in those words and give for the sake of Allah. And Allah, inshallah, will increase it for you. Click the button and donate now.
They want to know about Islam, we'll give them da'wah. They want to know what a Muslim does, we'll give them da'wah. When they want to hate on our deen, we'll give them da'wah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. This is Newcastle Fast FM. Inshallah, you can all hear me clearly. And we're back with the show From Darkness to Light. Alhamdulillah, this is a show that we've been doing out throughout the month of Ramadan with myself, Richard Coupland. Something that we do every 6 o'clock till 7 o'clock. Alhamdulillah, it's been a very beneficial month, I find. We've had a number of different guests on throughout the year, throughout the month, sharing their story to Islam. Brother Sergio, Brother Kiri, Brother Kin, Brother Alex. Alhamdulillah, we're joined by Brother Imran from Aira, sharing us about his experiences, explaining Islam to others. And we've touched upon various different topics with my wife as well on various different things. And we've had many solo shows with myself. And today's show is sort of continuing on from a show that I did previously, which was last week. Please apologise, I have got a bit of a cold. I did do a show last week in which we talked about the sciences of Hadeeth. We took a little look into the sciences of Hadeeth, some books to read on the topic, some of the terminologies that the scholars of Hadeeth use. We talked about, okay, how do we know that Hadeeth is Sahih? How do we know Hadeeth is weak, etc. And following on from that, inshallah, what we want to talk about today is something that I feel that for many of us as Muslims, and many of us that are new Muslims, those that are maybe new to the religion, or those that are just general Muslims, is something that we should really spend some time to learn about. And just to take some brief looks at the different types of Hadith books out there. Often we hear people quote Hadith, or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said this, and it's in the Mu'jam al-Kabir or Tabarani, or the Prophet said this in Sunan Abi Dawood, or Ibn Umar did this, and Imam Malik narrated it in his Muwatta, or Imam Ahmed narrated it in his Musnad. We hear these books, we hear these names, but we don't necessarily know what was the purpose of these books, where are these books, what are these books really about. So inshallah today what I want to talk about is to look a brief look at the books of Hadith. A brief look at the books of Hadith. We're going to start by looking at the different genres of Hadith, because the scholars of Hadith, they made different genres. A brief look, because there's many more genres than we're going to talk about. We're going to discuss some of the books in the genres, mention some of their names, when did their authors pass away, etc. And then we're going to zone into 3 or 4 particular books of Hadith and discuss, their authors, why were they written, some of the benefits from their books. But inshallah, a lot of what I've compiled today It's based on my own, experiences with the books, but a large portion of it is taken from Bilal Phillips's book, Usul al-Hadith, and various other works of, people, Mustafa al-Azami, studies in Hadith literature, and other works such as this that discuss about the books of Hadith, the genres, why were they written, the history of them. So inshallah, let's make a start. So there are many different genres of books of Hadith. Scholars, when they came to write books of Hadith, they had different goals and they had different formats in order to write these books. Some of them wanted to write a book that is only authentic. Some of them wanted to write a book that could be used as a book of fiqh. Some of them wrote books of hadith because they wanted to compile, all of the narrations that they had together and put them together. And they authored them in different ways. Some of them by narrator, some of them, narrate in book by subject topics. So inshallah, we'll go through them. One of the first types of books of hadith that we want to talk about is the musnad works. The musnad works. Now, in the hadith terminology, al-musnad, musnad, can refer to two things. If it's spoken in relation to the chain of narration of hadith, for example, someone said that this hadith is musnad, it means two things. It means firstly that it has a fully connected chain of narrators from the compiler all the way to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's a hadith that is marfu', as they call. It's raised to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's one thing. And secondly, it's fully connected. All the way from the compiler to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's fully connected. If it has these two conditions, it's raised to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his statement, his action, etc., and it's a fully connected chain. They call it a hadith that is musnad. Something that would break this, if it was something that was a statement of a companion, for example, Ibn Umar, it wouldn't be called musnad. Or if the hadith had breaks in its chains, it wouldn't be called musnad. However, as we learned in the previous lesson, this doesn't necessarily mean that the hadith is authentic. It just means that it fulfills two conditions of a hadith. However, when we talk about the books of hadith and the genres of hadith, when we talk about a musnad, it refers to a collection of hadith in which the author, is generally the case, the author organized it in the order of the companion. So, for example, the first Imam Ahmed, for example, in his musnad, he'll start first with Abu Bakr's narrations, then Umar's narrations, then Uthman's, then Ali's, etc. And he goes through in that order. And not often these works are very early, the musnad works. So, for example, it's different to other books. Like if you want to learn about, you'd open up the musnad of Ibn Masud, and everything in there will be about everything. It won't be on a particular topic. You could have salah, you could have dhikr, you could have stories from the seerah. You could have all these various topics built in the way of by the narrator, and by the companion narrator or a single important narrator that they narrated from. So, example of this is the Musnad of Abi Dawood At-Tayalisi, difficult one for me to say. He died in 813 of the Common Era. Musnad of the Imam Ahmed, which is one of the most famous ones. He died in 855 of the Common Era. The Musnad of Al-Humaydi, he died 834 of the Common Era. The Musnad of Abu Ya'la, he died 919 of the Common Era. And the Musnad of Abdul Hamid ibn Humayd, he died 863 of the Common Era. And there are a few other Musnad works that have been lost, that don't exist anymore. A few other Musnad works that have been published. But these are some of the main ones that if you go online now, go to Sifat al-Safwa, you go to Islamic bookshop that has Arabic books, you'll find many of these works. The most famous of them is the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, but Musnad of Abu Ya'la, huge beneficial work. And inshallah, we'll discuss a bit more about the Musnad of Imam Ahmed later. So the Musnad are large collections generally, ordered by a single narrator, often in the order of the companion. And because based on a single narrator, you'll have everything. So the hadiths of Aisha could be on everything and anything. They weren't necessarily ordered in a way to, for example, starting with purity, then salah, then fasting, then hajj. They weren't ordered in this way. The next works we wanted to really touch upon is something called the Musannaf works, the works of the Musannaf. Now, there are a number of different things you could put in this. For example, you could put the Sahih of Imam Bukhari in here, the Sahih of Imam Muslim. However, I've others and I myself have genreed it different. Some of the main Musannaf works that we want to mention here. These are very normally early works, and these are very early works in which the authors often they bring many things. They bring you the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They bring you statements of companions, statements of the tabi'een, statements of major scholars. So often, for example, in the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, when I've looked up some issues, it'll be like the chapter, those that permitted this. Then it'll list, it's narrated from Ibn Abbas and Ibn Masud and Qatada and this different tabi'i and Imam Malik that they didn't allow this or they did allow this. And then the next chapter will be those that did not allow this, which is very interesting. So, for example, if you open up the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, and you look at, there's a chapter title about those who allowed the wearing of a ta'weez from the Quran, and it'll quote you different companions who allowed it, Aisha maybe, etc., different tabi'een who allowed it. And then afterwards, you can go through and grade the hadith, and obviously in this situation, many of them are not authentic. Then the next chapter will be those that prohibited the wearing of ta'weez or ta'weez. So, for example, Ibn Masud prohibited it, Ibn Abbas, or examples. So it's very, very beneficial work because you'll get the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but you'll also get the fiqh, the understanding of the early companions, the understanding of those early scholars. So one of the famous works is the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, who's from Sana in Yemen. Great scholar. He wrote a number of different works. This is one of the works that has survived. It's quite a large work, filled with many narrations on fiqh and all these different topics. Hugely beneficial. He died 826 of the Common Era. The next work is the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba. This is a very large work, very famous, full of huge benefits. Many of the Bukhari, Muslim, Imam Ahmed, they all narrated from Ibn Abi Shayba. He's a very, very early scholar. A lot of beneficial narrations. And this is what is beautiful about Islam. This is what is an evidence, in my opinion, that Islam is true. Is that it's not like Judaism or Christianity or other religions where they had the text of the scripture, which was up for dispute if it's authentic, but they had nothing of the early people explaining it. They had very little of early people. Whereas subhanAllah, in Islam, we have Hadeeth, the Prophet explaining it. We have so many statements of companions. We have students of the companions. All these different views and all these different things have been narrated. Alhamdulillah, apologies. Have been narrated and preserved. And we can go back and check them and see what they said. Unlike many of the other religions who don't have this. SubhanAllah, amazing works, the Musannaf works, they're very large, full of all sorts of topics, the Quran and Hadith and prayer and this and that, everything you'll find in these works, very beneficial. So the next works that we want to talk about, alhamdulillah, is the works of Sahih. Sadly, I've just realized I forgot to put the dates in which they passed away. But I did the genre. Some scholars include these books in other genres. But these are works of scholars that their aim and objective was to collect books that contained only authentic hadith. That was their objective. Okay, I'm going to compile a book out of all the hadith that I know that are only authentic. And obviously, this is in the view of the author and view of maybe the scholars at their time. The most famous and what is said to be the most authentic book after the Quran is the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah, his famous work, which he compiled. Then after that, which is said to be the next or most authentic book after Sahih Bukhari, is the Sahih of Imam Muslim, rahimahullah. Huge beneficial work. It's, these two works form the foundations of the corpuses of hadith. If Bukhari and Muslim both narrated a hadith, many of the hadith scholars consider this to be the most highest and the most authentic level of reporting. Two other authentic collections of hadith, which are not as well known, but they're hugely beneficial, many of the scholars work with them and use them, is the Sahih of Ibn Khuzaymah. The Sahih of Ibn Khuzaymah is a huge beneficial work. It's been published, you can buy it, you can grab it, which Ibn Khuzaymah, he had the goal as well of collecting only authentic hadith. However, as many scholars mention, sometimes he didn't stick to his conditions as much. Sometimes he was a little lax, and that's why there are some Hasan hadith in here, there are some weak narrations in here. Similarly with the Sahih of Ibn Hibban, he had the same goal of collecting only authentic hadith. But many scholars mention, he didn't always stick to the conditions that he had. That's why sometimes there are Hasan hadith and some weak hadith in Ibn Hibban and Ibn Khuzaymah. So for many of the scholars, they agreed over the authenticity of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So generally, if a hadith is in these two books, generally you can accept it. However, with Ibn Khuzaymah and Ibn Hibban, further work still needs to be done. And it's the same with all these previous works that we mentioned of the Musnad collections, the Musannif collections. You're going to find many weak hadith in here, many hadith that are maybe fabricated or not authentic, because their goal of the author wasn't to compile only authentic hadith. Rather, it was to compile the narrations that they had on certain topics, narrations that they had that they found beneficial that they wanted to put in, not necessarily highlighting that they're all authentic. However, there is, maybe some hadith in Bukhari and some hadith in Muslim that some scholars spoke about, but it's like 99.99% is authentic. And inshallah, when we come to the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, we can mention maybe some of the scholars that discussed a few hadith that were not authentic in the work. Now, one of the big, as you can see, it takes up a large section there, of genre of hadith types is the works of the Sunan collections, the books of Sunan. And there are a number of these, number of different works. Abu Dawud, and Nisa'i, Ibn Majah. And often they're called Sunan works because in the other types of collections there was many different topics mentioned, things of historical nature, battles, seerah, this and that. However, with the Sunan collections, a large emphasis in the 2nd and 3rd century came to compile works that are very specific to statements of the Prophet ﷺ in relation to fiqh and belief issues. So often the Sunan works are ordered in the issues of fiqh. So you'll start with the book of Tahara, purity, the book of Salah, the book of fasting, the book of Hajj. This is why often they're ordered like that. If you look at the Sahih of Bukhari and Sahih Imam Muslim, some people class them as Musannif works. But however, the Bukhari and Muslim are generally considered Jami works that try to be comprehensive. You'll open up Bukhari, you'll have hadith on Salah, hadith on fasting, we'll have hadith on battles, hadith on belief in the hereafter, hadith on belief in Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, the book of how did the revelation begin. It's very comprehensive in many, many different topics. But many of the Sunan works, even though they do contain these narrations, many of them focused a lot on fiqh and Islamic law and certain Islamic beliefs. One of the most, well-known ones is the Sunan of Imam Abi Dawud, rahimahullah, who died in 888 of the Common Era. Abu Dawud, he's a famous scholar, traveled to many lands, but he came and he wanted to compile his Sunan. And many scholars, they said that, if somebody memorized and somebody learned the Sunan of Abi Dawud, they would have the majority of Hadith in relation to fiqh rulings. They would have the majority of Hadith in relation to fiqh rulings, and inshallah we'll talk a bit more about the Sunan of Abi Dawud later. Imam al-Nasa'i, rahimahullah, he had a number of works. He wrote a work. He's got a Sunan al-Sughra, the smaller Sunan, and a Sunan al-Kubra, the larger Sunan. Now, a Sunan al-Sughra, al-Mujtaba, this is the one that is part of the 6 famous books of Hadith. His smaller collection is part of the famous 6 books of Hadith. So originally he wrote a Sunan al-Kubra, which is larger, it's bigger. Alhamdulillah, it's published, it's beneficial. But then he decided to summarize it to collect even more authentic narrations, and he wrote a Sunan al-Sughra. Now many of the scholars after Bukhari and Muslim, out of the Kutub al-Sitta, they put Sunan al-Nisa'i as the next most authentic collection, even though it does contain weak narrations. Not everything in it is authentic, but it has majority in many authentic narrations. And again, he ordered it on relation to topics of Islamic law and things like that. And the Sunan of Imam Nasa'i is a huge beneficial read. And obviously his larger work, Al-Kubra, is much larger, but again, it's beneficial, but does contain weak narrations. Now, the next book is called Jami' at-Tirmidhi, also known as Sunan at-Tirmidhi. And inshallah, we'll talk about it more later. But again, this is a beneficial work, which many scholars put as a Sunan, but many of them mention that it's actually al-Jami'. It's called al-Jami' al-Kabir. It's a comprehensive collection which he speaks about so many different topics. But Imam at-Tirmidhi, it's a hugely beneficial work, and we'll talk about why later. So that's, Bukhari, Muslim, and Nisa'i, Abi Dawud, Ibn Majah, and Tirmidhi, they make up the major collections of hadith. But inshallah, we're going to go for a short break, and I will return inshallah after this.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Don't you just hate it? Every time you switch on the TV, scroll through Facebook, or read a newspaper, it's Muslims have done this and Muslims have done that. They're barbaric, this religion is dangerous, etc., etc., etc. The saddest thing is that so many people out there believe it. It's people like you and I who need to dismantle these misconceptions by showing how beautiful Islam is. If it wasn't for such amazing dawah organizations out there, many people wouldn't be Muslim today. One such amazing organization is the Islamic Diversity Center. For over 17 years now, they've been building bridges within communities and calling people towards Islam through education, awareness, engagement, and empowerment. Their amazing work has resulted in hundreds of people accepting Islam and thousands more understanding that Islam is not about killing and murder. Rather, it is a peaceful religion full of understanding, harmony, and worship. In order to continue guiding the masses, they urgently need to raise £50,000. That's just 500 people donating £100 each. Now, as Muslims, if we can't sacrifice our time and resources to call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then at least we should sacrifice a tiny percentage of our wealth, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with. Please donate £100 today and earn sadaqah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Apologies for the short intermission. There's somebody at the front door. I had to go answer the front door. But alhamdulillah, this is where we're back. And the Sunan works I mentioned there, Abi Dawud and Nisa'i, at-Tirmidhi. The final one, which is often collected in the Kutub al-Sitta. The Kutub al-Sitta are the 6 major books of hadith which the Muslims have agreed upon or accept. Imam Bukhari Sahih, Imam Muslim Sahih, the Sunan al-Nisa'i, as-Sughra, the Sunan of Abi Dawud, the Jami' of Imam at-Tirmidhi. These were agreed upon. Now, the sixth book, some of the scholars differed. Many of the scholars, they put a book we'll talk about later, they put the Muwatta of Imam Malik as the sixth book in the Sitta. However, many of the scholars, they said that the majority of hadith and narrations in the Muwatta of Imam Malik you can find in all of the other five collections, many of them in Bukhari, many of them in Muslim, many of them in Abi Dawud. So they thought, okay, so they decided to take the Muwatta of Imam Malik out, and many of them put the Sunan of Imam Ibn Majah in its place, because the Sunan of Imam Ibn Majah brought a number of extra hadith that were not found in the other five books. Some of them, I believe they put Sunan Darimi or Daraqutni instead in the works. So Sunan Ibn Majah is one of the sixth book out of the Kutub Sitta, and it's seen as it's a hugely beneficial work. Imam Ibn Majah, his Muqaddimah, his introduction about sticking to the Sunnah and following the Prophet ﷺ is amazing, and he brought many ahadith that were not found in the other books, many authentic narrations. But again, the Sunnah of Imam Ibn Majah does have weak narrations. It does have some narrations that are even, in some cases, fabricated. So, for example, depending on the numbering, it's collected that he had 4,341 narrations in Sunan Ibn Majah, had 32 different books, and 1,500 chapters. Out of them, 3,002 are found in the other five books. So he brings an extra around about 1,300 extra beneficial narrations that weren't found in the other five books. Out of the remaining 1,339 hadiths, which Ibn Majah recorded alone, 428 are authentic, 199 were Hasan, 613 were weak, and 99 were munkar, fabrications. So, again, the Sunan works, they have authentic, they have weak, they have inauthentic, they have fabricated, they have different gradings in the hadith. So if somebody says to you, oh, there's a hadith in Sunan Ibn Majah that the Prophet ﷺ said this, alhamdulillah, it's beneficial, but you need to still check its authenticity. Or there's a hadith in Sunan at-Tirmidhi, you still need to check its authenticity, because many times Imam at-Tirmidhi, he weakens narrations in his own book. He says this narration is not authentic. These are the most famous Sunan works, those four. But there are others, the Sunan of Imam al-Darimi, the Sunan of Daraqutni. Al-Bayhaqi has different Sunans too. Sunan al-Kubra, and they say that his Shu'ab al-Iman also works by his. Sunan al-Dailami, there's, I think it's cut off, you can't see it because of the thing. The Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur. There's many various different Sunan works out there, and alhamdulillah, they're very beneficial. If a person can buy them, Daraqutni, Darimi, Bayhaqi, and many narrations they contain. Al-Bayhaqi, rahimahullah, he brought so many narrations, alhamdulillah. His works are very large. The final area we want to talk about is the Mu'jam works. So, for example, the Mu'jam works are often quite later works by later scholars. And they differ. Sometimes it's ordered in alphabetical names of companions. Sometimes it's based on regions of the narrators. And sometimes it's based on alphabetical names of teachers. So, for example, At-Tabarani in some of his works, it's ordered based on his teachers, which sometimes can make it difficult to go through. The Sunan works are quite nice. Okay, I want a hadith on fasting. I open up a Tirmidhi, I go to the chapter on fasting and start reading the hadith. But with these works, they're more encyclopedic in their nature. They're based on the narrators. We're only going to mention, some of the most famous Mu'jam works, and they're all by Imam al-Tabarani. That is Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, the larger Mu'jam, Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, the medium, and Al-Mu'jam al-Saghir, the smaller. The Mu'jam al-Kabir, it's 12 volumes, it's published in different ways. It has around about 25,000 narrations. It's found that, the medium Mu'jam's in 6 volumes, and the smaller Mu'jam you can get a smaller work, but these are different sizes. Alhamdulillah, each one has extra beneficial hadith. But in these works of the Mu'ajam, you'll find many weak hadith. Even the narrator will tell you that they're weak when he narrates them about the narrators. So if there's narration, you see Imam al-Tabarani, he narrated it in his Al-Mu'ajam al-Kabir. That needs some serious checking because it might be weak, it could be authentic, but we need research done. And the final work that I really want to highlight is a work by Imam Malik ibn Anas. Imam Malik ibn Anas, and we'll touch upon it later. And it's his Muwatta. And this work is very interesting. Some scholars say it's a book of hadith because it contains hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, but some say it's a book of fiqh because it contains many rulings of companions, rulings of Imam Malik. You'll say Imam Malik ruled this, Imam Malik's views was this. So it's a very interesting work, what we'll touch upon. So these are some of the genres of hadith. There are other genres, the Zawaid ones, the Mustadrak, different genres. But inshallah, these are some of the main ones that we can take today. But we want to focus in on some of the main books. And one of the earliest works that we have in Islam, one of the works that is very, very beneficial, is the work of Imam Malik. And Imam Malik, rahimahullah, he was a major scholar at his time. As is mentioned here, he was born in Medina in the year 717. He studied under many of the great scholars of Medina. Many of his teachers were the students or companions, for example, al-Zuhri, Nafi', who was the freed slave of Ibn Umar, and many other scholars he studied under, and became the giant of Medina, the Imam al-Ahl Sunnah, Imam of this deen, Imam Malik. His book that he made, the Muwatta, it's very interesting work. It contains hadith, which is hugely beneficial, statements of the Prophet, but it contains many statements of companions, views of Ibn Umar, views of different companions, which is beneficial as well. Have some statements here and there of tabi'een, some of his teachers, az-Zuhri, etc. And also, which is hugely beneficial to get the fiqh, the understanding of Imam Malik, is that it has the rulings of himself as well. So often Imam Malik will explain a hadith and judge based on a certain part of a hadith. Many of the stories say he compiled it at the request of the Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who wanted a comprehensive code of law based on the Sunnah. So they asked him, okay, can you make us a comprehensive book of Islamic fiqh, Islamic law, that we can rule the country with? So he wrote it, and then the Caliph, he wanted to make it compulsory that every single person had to follow and had to rule by this. But Imam Malik didn't want that. Imam Malik didn't allow that. And it's not mentioned because maybe he said that maybe some hadith he didn't know, etc. And the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, he also requested similar for him. He wanted to make this book, throughout the Muslim empire as the manual that everyone must follow. But Imam Malik didn't want that because he knew that maybe there was some knowledge that had left him, maybe some knowledge that he missed. But alhamdulillah, he strove hard to write this book, and it's a very, 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 very beneficial work that he worked on for many times, and it's narrated in different ways. Some narrations are longer, some of them are smaller because sometimes he took out hadith later on in his life. Obviously, depending on the numbering and the counting, it contains 600 marfu' hadith. Marfu' means hadith that are statements or actions of the Prophet ﷺ. 613 mawquf narrations, which are narrations that reach the companion. 285 maqtu' narrations, which are narrations that reach tabi'een. And 222 mursal narrations. And a mursal narration is narration which generally is defined as that a tabi'i, a student of a companion, narrates something that the Prophet said without mentioning the companion, and it's a form of weak hadith. However, here I think the author he meant narrations that are missing chains. So often Imam Malik will narrate the Prophet said something, or the tabi'i, he'll narrate from a tabi'i that the Prophet said something, or he'll narrate from a Zuhri said the Prophet said something. But these are not necessarily authentic, but they're interesting narrations. So it's a wide variety, not just hadith, rulings, different views of different companions, etc. Has a number of beneficial explanations. The most famous are Ibn Abdul Bar's At-Tamheed and is Al-Istithqar. These are, large works, beneficial works. And it's mentioned Ibn Abdul Barr is a Tamheed and other works, all these mursal narrations that I mentioned and narrations that were maybe not fully authentic. He searched hard to find the chain of narrations to connect them all and found hard to strived hard to authenticate all of the narrations. So it's a huge work, beneficial work to refer to. This work is very good. You can obviously have many publications in Arabic. This is a good copy. Again, though, this obviously will have authentic and inauthentic narrations. You can grab it in English. Darul Kutub al Ilmiya. Alhamdulillah, they've published it in. They published it in English, 2 volumes. Translation isn't that great. Alhamdulillah, it's okay. Obviously, you can find different English versions online, PDFs, etc. So it's a great work to read. And it's a great. Before the Sahih Bukhari came along, Imam Shafi'i, I believe he said that this is the most authentic book of hadith on the face of the earth. So the time of Imam Shafi'i, he viewed this book as one of the most authentic books of hadith. And it is because it's really early. Sometimes Imam Malik narrates from Nafi', from Ibn Umar, the companion, the Prophet said. So between him and the Prophet, there's only 2 people. There's only him and a companion, there's 1 person. So these are chains of narration that there's no doubt of the authenticity, because Ibn Umar is agreed upon his truthfulness, and Nafi is one of the major brilliant narrators of hadith. So amazing work, the Muwatta of Imam Malik. We'll quickly jump into the other ones because time is short. The Musnad of Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah. Imam Ahmed, an amazing imam, amazing scholar of this religion who stood up to defend it. He wrote an amazing work, his Musnad, which is a very, very large collection. He is Imam Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. He was born 780 CE in Mulv and grew up in Baghdad. And he studied under the many great scholars of his time, such as Imam Shafi'i, and became an imam and a leader in his own right. And he has obviously the famous madhab, al-Hanbali madhab, is based off his views and his rulings and his students who carried on his madhab. Now his work, the Musnad work, as I said, it is a work that's narrated by the companion, starting with Abu Bakr, then Umar, the Khulafa al-Rashideen, then the 10-point promised Jannah, etc. It goes by the companion of the narrator. And depending on your numberings, sometimes it's 27,000, sometimes more, but it's around 30,000 narrations, depending on the numbering. And he narrated by 904 different companions on a wide range of topics, such as rituals, laws, prophecies, seerah, battles. So this work, you'll have everything in it. It's not specific to a particular topic. You'll have works on all sorts of different things. However, it does contain a wide range of authentic and inauthentic narrations. So if somebody narrates a hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, alhamdulillah, beautiful work, beautiful thing, but you do need to check its chain of narration. Ahmed Shaka has a beneficial checking. Shu'aib al-Naud did amazing work. And this situation here, it's published in one edition in 52 volumes. Another edition, you can get it compressed into 2 massive volumes. But again, it's a large work that is very beneficial, and alhamdulillah, it's a great service to the hadith literature. Now, the final works and some of the most major works, the one is the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari. Imam al-Bukhari, famous scholar, he wrote his book, which is commonly known as Sahih al-Bukhari, but it has a full title, which is Al-Jami' al-Sahih al-Musnad al-Mukhtasar min Hadith Rasulullahi wa Sunnahi wa Ayyamihi, which means Al-Jami', which means a comprehensive, meaning it's discussing all the various different topics. As-Sahih, the authentic. Al-Musnad, again, is those narrations that reach the Prophet ﷺ and they're connected in their chains from the hadith of the Messenger of God and his Sunnah and his ayyam, like his times and his days. So we learn from this, okay, it's a work that it's mukhtasar. I missed that. It's mukhtasar. It's abridged. It doesn't contain everything. It's a summarized mukhtasar, summarized work. It's not meant to contain everything. It's meant to be a summarized work for us to benefit from. discussing hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, authored by Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, born in the year 810 and died in the year 870. And what's really a quick benefit of Imam Bukhari is that his great-grandfather Al-Mughira accepted Islam at the hand of the Muslim governor of Bukhara, Al-Yaman al-Ju'fi. So his great-grandfather wasn't Muslim, but alhamdulillah he accepted Islam and began raising his family upon Islam. And then his grandson, his great-grandson became Imam al-Bukhari. So subhanAllah, think about the road you can get if you tell someone about Islam, they accept Islam, you're changing entire generations. Who knows from your lineage who's going to be a major scholar like Imam al-Bukhari, a major scholar in the religion. Al-Mughira didn't have any idea. He never met Imam al-Bukhari, yet his offspring raised this great Imam who, you can speak for hours and hours and hours. There's, many books written on him. He's a great scholar, studied under many of the major scholars of his time, traveled much of the Muslim lands to Mecca, Bukhara, where he's from, different areas, learning the hadith and studying the hadith. Now his work, depending on the numbering, contains 9,082 narrations, 2,062 after repetitions, and his goal was to compile a book of authentic hadith. After, his teacher, Ibn Ishaq, mentioned that it would be great if somebody compile a book of only authentic hadith. It really affected his heart and he wanted to do that. So that's why he went out, strove hard to compile an only authentic book of hadith. He authored other works such as Al-Adab al-Mufrad, which is a beneficial work on manners and characteristics in the religion. It's not all authentic, has weak narrations, but it's a great work. One of his earliest works, which is said that when he was 18 years old he wrote about, is a Tarikh al-Kabir, and he has a version as Al-Awsat and Al-Saghir, which is a book about the hadith narrators, the Ilm al-Rijal, a very difficult topic in the sciences of hadith. He wrote about that only at 18 years of age, it said, subhanAllah. Then he has Khalq Afal al-Ibad, a book on belief about a refutation of the Qadariyah, those that denied Qadr and denied that Allah created people's actions. He wrote a refutation of them, bringing ayat, hadith about it. And then he wrote a book on Raf'ul Yadayn, raising the hands in the prayer, establishing that we should raise the hands multiple times in the salah. And he wrote a number of other works. There's a work of his Aqidah that is narrated from him. Now, Imam Bukhari, many of the scholars, they said that this book is 100% Sahih, and they agreed upon this. And the majority of scholars, they said this. And they have the famous phrase that the most authentic book after the Quran is Sahih al-Bukhari. However, there's a famous statement of Imam Shafi'i that Allah does not allow any other book than his book to be perfect. So meaning that Imam al-Bukhari Sahih, maybe some scholars did mention that there were some weak hadith, some minor issues, not like minor things in it. So for example, Imam Badal al-Qutni, famous hadith scholar that we mentioned, he said there was around about 200 weak hadith in it. As-Suyuti mentioned that there were criticisms over 80 narrators and 110 hadiths. Shaykh al-Albani, rahimahullah, he commented on a few hadiths. But the point is that the majority of the work is authentic, 99%. It's a very, a small amount of hadith in which there was discussion about. So generally, if you see a hadith in this work, you can accept it. And even if there was a discussion about some of the narrations, that they're in other books with authentic narrations that highlight that it is authentic. So there's that minor discussion amongst the scholars. But generally, this is the main book that you should study. And what's amazing about Sahih Bukhari is the way that Imam Bukhari ordered it. And he put chapter titles, in which in the chapter title, he'll bring you a hadith related to the chapter title, and you get to learn the fiqh, the understanding of Imam Bukhari. And it's an amazing, powerful work that scholars memorize, study, and it's a great work and has many explanations, the most famous of them being Fathul Bari of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Final two works, the Sunan of Imam Abu Dawud that we mentioned earlier. Imam Abu Dawud is called Abu Dawud Sulaiman ibn al-Ashath al-Sijistani. He's born in 817 Common Era in Sijistan, which is currently in Khorasan. And this is a great work. Depending on the numbering, it contains 5,274 narrations, some authentic, some inauthentic. But many of the scholars mentioned that his aim of his work was to compile narrations in relation to legal rulings in this religion. He included authentic and non-authentic narrations in his work. For example, he writes in his Sunan, "This is an inauthentic Munkar hadith. Certainly it is related by Ibn Jurayj from Zihad ibn Sa'ad from Az-Zuhri from Anas that he said that the Prophet ﷺ had put on a ring made of palm leaf, which he in time discarded. The mistake in this hadith is to be attributed to Hammam, as no other narrator has related it. So the point here is that even Imam Abu Dawud, in a number of narrations, he mentions that it's inauthentic, he mentions that it's a broken chain, he mentions that it's mursal, in many of his discussions. So this work is an amazing work. And as I said, many scholars, Imam al-Ghazali, I think others mentioned that if you memorize the Quran and the Sunan of Abu Dawud, you would have a huge amount of fiqh, because you would have so many of the hadith related to ahkam. Imam Abu Dawud, it said that he preferred to use a weak hadith over qiyas, over analogy, and that often in his book he would bring the chapter title on a hukum, on an issue, and he would put the hadith that the scholars used, even if it was inauthentic. He wanted to highlight the hadith that the scholars work with in his work. So it's a great work to study and read. Now, the final work, which I think is one of my most favorite works at the moment, is the Jami' of Imam at-Tirmidhi, also known as Sunan at-Tirmidhi. This work is amazing. Its author is Imam Abu Isa Muhammad ibn Isa ibn Sawra ibn Musa ad-Dahhak at-Tirmidhi. There's a discussion, was he born in Mecca, was he born in Tilmid? Many scholars mention that he was born in Mecca, and there's a discussion about when he was born, but we'll take that he was born in Mecca in the year 821. But it is agreed upon that he died in Tilmid in 892. And that's why he's called a Tilmidi, because he grew up in that area, in that city, in that town. Now his work, depending on numbering, contains 3,956 narrations of various levels of authenticity. Even himself, he will weaken some narrations. He will grade narrations as authentic. But what's really amazing about his work is, one, he ordered it on topics related to Islamic law and belief. So you can open up the book of Salah and it's ordered, the book of fasting and it's ordered and topics. But what's great about his work is that he's one of the scholars that actually graded the hadith after he narrated it. So he'll say, "Hada hadithun hasanun sahih." This hadith is Hasan Sahih. Hada hadithun Hasan. This hadith is Hasan. Hada hadithun gharib. This hadith is gharib, strange. So he'll grade the hadith for you. That's an extra level of fiqh, because we get the grading of a great imam of hadith on the hadith. And what's amazing, he'll bring you different pathways of the hadith, different chains, and he'll tell you that it's been narrated by different companions from different hadiths, which is really beneficial as well. But what's really good is, often he discusses Islamic rulings. He'll tell you what the scholars said about certain issues. The majority of scholars said this. Imam Shafi'i said this. Imam Malik said this. Imam Ahmed said this. Ibn Ishaq said this. Al-Awza'i said this. The majority of the companions had this view. So you'll read the hadith, and then afterwards you'll get that fiqh of the early scholars. And subhanAllah, it's an amazing one. So for example, he'll say, a similar tradition has been related by many of those who possess knowledge among the companions and the followers. And this is the opinion of Sufyan al-Thawri and the jurists of Kufa, who hold that a kiss does not invalidate one's ablution. So he's bringing hadith related, if you kiss or touch your wife, does it break the wudu? He's telling you that the view that it doesn't is a view of many of the companions and the tabi'een that possess knowledge. It's the view of Sufyan al-Thawri and the scholars of Kufa. So that means Abu Hanifa and his disciples. He'll tell you the other views: Malik ibn Anas, Al-Awza'i, Al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmed ibn Ishaq. That's not Ibn Ishaq. SubhanAllah. The teacher Imam Bukhari is just Ishaq. It's not Ibn Ishaq. Ishaq, they hold the view that a kiss does invalidate wudu, and this is the opinion of many learned companions and successors. Our people, such as Malik, Ahmed, did not follow the hadith of Aisha. So he's giving you the different views of the scholars. Which hadith did they work with? Which hadith did they not work with? And it's an amazing work because you gain those extra benefits as you read along. And it's so comprehensive in its nature. So brothers and sisters, Jazakallah khair for listening. Inshallah, you benefited from this. A short look at some of the collections of hadith. Many of the works, grab this work, many of the things in English. And really, many of the works, alhamdulillah, are in English. Really try and understand these works and work with these works. However, these works are the works of scholars. They are works which were compiled for scholars. So maybe there are some things that are difficult to understand. There are issues of needing to grade narrations. So obviously, if you read these works, always refer back to a scholar for clarification on the issue. But inshallah, you benefited from today's talk on the various books of hadith. And inshallah, I will be back tomorrow with my wife discussing racism and its position in Islam. Is it allowed in Islam? And what does Islam say on the topic? Jazakallah khair for listening. Brother Rashid, inshallah, you benefited. And any of the other listeners, inshallah, you benefited. Feel free to contact Newcastle Foster Family if you have any other questions. This has been From Darkness to Light with myself, Richard Coupland. Inshallah, I will be back tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.